On.
All right, thank you. And thank you for coming today. It's a privilege to be here and to talk to you about this trip that my father made in 1933. I'll give you just a little bit of background. My dad was born in 1911 in Valparaiso, Indiana. Both my parents were born in Valpo. And Dad was born on May 9th. So this is a little shout out to my dad. Happy birthday today. And I feel like it's a little serendipitous, wonderful little thing to do in memory of him and in honor of my father today. So thank you. We have old roots here in Marshall County. My great-grandparents settled on 8th Road between Fir and Gumwood and raised their family there and had extended family that came with them as well. And my parents did finally move back to Indiana in 1996. Both of them are gone by now, and they're buried out at Mount Pleasant Cemetery on 10th Road. So they're here, they're close. As Dad was getting older, well, first of all, I'll back up and say that when we were children growing up, things would trigger my dad's memory a little bit about this excursion he took in 1933. And we got vignettes of that story from time to time, but never really heard the whole thing. And so my siblings and I all encouraged him to write down the story, put it on paper. And he decided to go ahead and print it, and only had about 12 dozen copies made, and most of those are gone and spoken for, and the last 2 or 3 that I have will probably go to great-grandsons or something like that. So I'm not here to sell you a book today. But I'd like to share with you what he published in 2004. He was 93 years old when he published that. Okay, to go back to 1933 and give you a little bit of a setup on what his situation was. He was graduating from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, with a degree in accounting. But of course, because of the Great Depression, it was difficult for people to find jobs. He stayed in Evanston because he was able to get a job at the Chicago World's Fair that summer. He was a coolie pushing roller chairs. People that wanted to have an easier way to get around the grounds of the World Fair could hire a coolie. A couple could hire 2 coolies, and the coolies got paid on a commission basis plus tips. But of course, that was irregular, and it wasn't a lot of money. So I think that Hershel was checking the newspapers all of the time for the help wanted ads. They don't even have those these days, hardly do they? Dad rented an attic room in a home a couple of blocks from the campus of Northwestern that was owned by a professor that was working in the engineering department at Northwestern. It wasn't a room and board kind of situation, but he had a room there. And to help to pay for some of those expenses, he did have a job in the dining hall working on the campus at Northwestern. But after graduation, all of that comes to an end. And so that's when he got the job working at the World's Fair and was doing that. In the house where he was renting a room, there was another young man by the name of Jim McGibbon, who was from Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada. And he kept saying to my dad, Jim hadn't graduated yet, but he kept saying to my dad, if you'd come home to Canada with me, you could get a job at a bank or something like that. And my dad kind of passed that off. But one day, he was looking at the Chicago Tribune, and he spotted an ad that Studebaker from South Bend was interviewing the next day in Chicago for drivers to put together a caravan to transport Studebakers from the plant in South Bend to a dealership in Los Angeles. And that sparked something in my dad. This would have been July 13th. And he showed the ad to Jim. I think Jim wanted to go home. Over the summer, before he started the next school year, but just didn't really have any plans made yet. And he looked at that and they thought that's how they could get to the West Coast. Jim had an uncle in Long Beach. He had a sister in Vancouver that was a nurse. The uncle in Long Beach was a doctor. So Jim's family had medicine in their genes. Dad had a sister in San Francisco, and he did have a brother that was going to school at the University of Washington in Seattle, but he was back here in Indiana, home on his summer break. Anyway, the two of them looked at that and thought, well, if we got to the West Coast, then we could hitchhike between the homes of these relatives that they had and get up to Vancouver, and then they could kind of see how things would work out after that. And Dad was thinking, well, and if prospects for jobs were a little better up there, maybe this is a good opportunity. They did stop to pay attention to the detail that evening. They didn't want to just walk out on the people that they were renting their rooms from. And Mr. and Mrs. McKibben didn't need the rent from those rooms so badly that they weren't willing to say, yes, we're a little concerned about this, but if you get hired, don't worry about it. So on July 14th, they went to interview for the jobs. This clearly had to have been in Chicago. They got the jobs, they got hired. And I don't know how many details they had ahead of time on this, but they knew that this is July 14th, they had to report on July 17th to the Studebaker plant in South Bend. So they spent their next 3 days pretty busy getting themselves organized. I don't have a lot of details about that, but I think that they were probably thinking about what all they were going to need long term. Dad was thinking about what he was going to need if he got all the way to Vancouver. Short term, what were they going to need if they were going to hitchhike? Well, even just, would you leave from here to go to LA without having a suitcase? There were things to pack, and they were getting themselves organized. They knew that they had to have some money, and Jim had a regular allowance. Hershel had a little saved from that job that he was working at the World's Fair. And Mrs. Smith, God bless her, gave him $75. Their plan was to camp out, cook their own inexpensive meals, and hitchhike up the West Coast after they got to Los Angeles. And my dad was thinking $75 certainly seemed like a lot of money, and he decided to put $25 between the pages of a book. He left some of his personal belongings packed up in a couple of boxes in his room in Evanston. And on July 17th, they were at they took the South Shore Railroad to South Bend and reported to the Studebaker plant. They met the leader of this caravan, who was from the Paul G. Hoffman company, the dealership in Los Angeles. And there was also a Studebaker plant engineer that was driving kind of a service truck because there was going to be oil changes, oil checks, water checks, tire checks, and just to be prepared in case of any other eventualities. Studebaker hired 14 drivers plus a spare, one extra person. And each driver was to drive one car and tow one car. And the leader was the lead driver. So I estimate that there were 30, by my count, there's 30 vehicles that are going to Los Angeles. They reported at 10 a.m. They had a brief orientation. and they were on their way at 11:30. I think they give you a longer orientation at McDonald's than that. If you want to check later, after the program, there's a copy out of the book. I was just astounded what my dad still had left over, record-wise, from making that trip. And he had a sheet of the instructions that they gave them at the Studebaker plant. They were to drive 300 feet behind the next car in front of them. Under no circumstances were they supposed to pass for any reason. And it says through your rear view mirror, they were to watch for the car behind them, and if that car stopped, they were supposed to stop. If that car slowed down, you were supposed to slow down and blow your horn to alert the person in front of you. Of course, you're driving standard transmissions in the day, and some of these drivers were relatively young and perhaps inexperienced, but even if they knew how to drive a tractor, they knew something about a standard transmission, right? So they needed to start in low gear only and to slow down and stop as gradually as conditions would permit. And especially if you're towing a vehicle, there are a few other considerations like that. The mechanic and the leader from the Hoffman Company was at the head of the caravan and set the pace at 30 miles an hour for the first 500 miles. You break in the engine, right? New cars. And then 35 miles thereafter, never faster. They warned them not to strain their cars in high gear and to shift when necessary. And they said they would stop twice each day and test all tire pressure on the cars. The mechanics would clean the air filters at regular intervals, and every 500 miles they would do an oil change. And lubrication. While the tires were being checked, the drivers were supposed to check the water in the radiator of the vehicle they were driving. And each evening, the car would get a complete and thorough examination. The drivers would see to it that the canvas covers over the front of the car and the fenders, also the seat covers, were kept in place at all times. And you will absolutely adhere to all traffic laws, both in cities and on the highways. You personally will assume all responsibility for any infractions to the law. And to remember that there's an engineer from the Studebaker factory in this caravan to see that all the above conditions are adhered to. When they left South Bend, they headed across Route 2 that took them down to Valparaiso. And when the caravan stopped, the two cars that my dad was responsible for were just adjacent to, across the road, the house that my dad grew up in. He had called his parents to say what he was doing, but he hadn't had a chance to see them. And he checked with the leader to see how long they were going to be there. And he said, 15 or 20 minutes. And he said, well, that's my house. Is it okay if I go over and say goodbye to my family? Which he got permission to do. And his mother really quickly whipped up a couple of sandwiches apiece for Hershel and Jim, and they were really glad to have those. All right. We've got about 5,000 miles to cover, and I'm not going to be able to tell all of it to you. They spent that first night in Kankakee, Illinois, and Dad told a fun story about buying a watermelon. They went out for a walk for some exercise, he and Jim, and just sat down on the curb and broke open the melon and were eating it, and then they started to burp, and they got to laughing and then having a contest. And pretty soon there were two girls sitting on the porch in the house that was behind them, and they got to laughing about as hard as Hershel and Jim did. And the men were a little bit embarrassed, but they decided not to, just, they didn't let them on that they knew that the girls were there. You can see from the map up here, the route that they took from South Bend. When they drove, Kankakee was their first night stop. The next day they were going around St. Louis, and that was the only major city that really did not have a viable way for them to just get around the city without having to go through it. So they stopped before and gassed up and everything and got instructions that, first of all, in St. Louis, there was a law that you couldn't parade more than 5 vehicles without a permit and a police escort. So they split them up into groups and had them start out separately so that they could go across the city without being a parade, so to speak. And they rendezvoused on the west side of the city, and by now they were on Route 66, which was the major, as I understand it, Route 66 was built to be the major connecting route between Chicago and Los Angeles, right? Is that right? Okay. It was the next day that Hershel was driving along and noticed that the guy from the Studebaker plant had pulled in behind him and then motioned for him to stop and pulled him over and told him that he had been weaving. Well, Dad didn't think he was doing that, so the engineer got into the car with him and had the spare driver drive the service truck. And what they realized is the car in the back was weaving, and there was some of the tow bar gear had come loose, and it meant stops to get all of that fixed, and then they were on their way. But Dad was just a little alarmed for a minute. He thought, they're not going to fire me, are they? He was a little scared about that. Just jump ahead to one of their incidents southwest of Sweetwater, Texas. And I estimate that it was down in here somewhere. It was a 100-degree day, and late in the afternoon, everybody was just a little tired and had just been, driving. And that afternoon, all of a sudden, there was a slowdown in front that the people in the back part of the caravan weren't expecting. And by the time my Dad realized that he needed to stop, he hit the brakes hard and stopped within about 2 feet of the car in front of him. The guy behind him could see that he wasn't going to be able to stop without hitting that car that was being towed. And he took to the ditch, jackknifed the 2 cars that he was responsible for, but it gave room for everybody else behind to come to a stop. Well, of course, the leader comes back to find out what on earth is going on, because that stopped the whole caravan, using that rule about if you see the person behind you stop, you stop. And the young man that was driving that car, Dad says, probably wasn't more than 16 years old, and it shook him up. I mean, you ever get a fright or a start that just brings tears to your eyes? I think that's what he was experiencing, and had trouble explaining to the leader what had happened, and my father took over and described what the situation was, and he said, even though that had jackknifed the cars and caused a few dents and a few fenders, that move probably saved them a lot of other damage. And so the boss told the driver of the car, after they had those out of the ditch, things were ready, they were drivable. He said, you're doing a good job, get back in your car, keep up the good work, we're going to be stopping in about an hour. So those kinds of incidents happened along the way. There was one more after they passed into, oh, I'd just like to say that as they were coming south. They departed Route 66 because they could get across the southern tip of the Rockies down here at El Paso without going over any high mountain passes. The highest point that they saw there was under 3,700 feet. And on the other side and into Arizona, there's a Coolidge Dam, did I say that right?
Yeah.
President Coolidge, named after President Coolidge. And they had one more accident that day. A fellow that was driving two of the vehicles didn't slow down enough. They were coming downhill and making a sharp right-hand turn to drive across the top of the dam. That was pretty amazing to my dad. And anyway, this young man didn't slow down enough, and when he took that turn, the back car swung around and pulled the front car, and they scraped both cars against the concrete wall. That young man got quite the tongue lashing, got fired on the spot, and had to ride the rest of the way with the service vehicle to Los Angeles. And they indeed did put the spare driver into place then for the rest of that trip. They stopped that afternoon in Van Horn, Texas. There were mountains in view. Days 7 and 8, I said about crossing the Rockies to do this. So they decided to pack up everything except the bare necessities, and they could inexpensively ship their suitcases by rail, and they sent them to San Francisco. And once they had themselves all packed and had all of their details put together, they got information about how to take a streetcar out to the end of the line and out to the highway where they would start to hitchhike the next day. They found some place to sleep. Would we call that homeless today? Just might. And they fixed a little breakfast, probably of oatmeal, the next morning. They started hitchhiking, and the first person that stopped to give them a ride was driving a pickup and pulling a flatbed trailer. And he asked them where they were going, and he said, well, I'm going 100 miles north, and if I give you a ride, would you be willing to help me load the wheat when I got there? And of course, Jim and Dad thought that would be just fine, and climbed in and had a nice chat with the man while they were driving the 100 miles that he was going for the work he was doing. And when they got to the field, there was it was a huge pile of bags of wheat, and each one of them weighed about 100 pounds. He said each one was about 1.5 bushels of wheat. So it was a lot of work for them to help load that trailer, and they felt like they had earned their travel that particular day. I think they were tired and hungry and just wanted to find a place to get some rest, maybe got a ride or two later that day, but they found a place to spend an overnight and got up the next morning and fixed themselves some breakfast when they saw my dad saw a pickup truck coming up the road. And he said, get up there and find out if you can get a ride. And so Jim's up there thumbing for a ride, and Dad's gathering things up from their encampment. Well, the guy stopped, and he had somebody else riding with him in the cab of the truck, so he said, but you can ride in the back. And they both hopped up in the back of the truck, and then my dad spied that his athletic sweater from Northwestern was still lying on the ground, and he jumped off the vehicle and ran and grabbed that sweater. And he ran hard to get back to the truck, the pickup, but the driver was pulling away fast, probably didn't see them, and they were gone. And Dad just says, I'll meet you in the next town. He'll just call that to Jim. And so he ended up walking, and probably about 5 miles to get to the next town. No Jim. I'm guessing the driver didn't stop in the next town. But he went to the second town. It was a small place, and he thought, oh, I don't know what the chances are of finding Jim here. But yes, indeed, he did. He saw him with all of their equipment, and they were two happy people when they got back together again. And just to kind of briefen this up a little bit, they did get to San Francisco. Let me make sure I'm not skipping an important part. Oh, I will have to say that because hitchhiking was not proving to be a really quick way for them to travel, there were reports in the papers about people picking up hitchhikers and getting robbed. They were noticing on the railroad that paralleled the highway that there were a lot of men riding up on those boxcars. And they started to think about maybe there was going to be a faster way for them to get to Canada. Their next stop was planned in San Francisco, and just briefly I'll say that they enjoyed a nice day of sightseeing in San Francisco, cable cars, Chinatown, Fisherman's Wharf, a bag of fresh boiled shrimp at Fisherman's Wharf. Dad said he'd never tasted shrimp before and thought that was just excellent. They even took a streetcar into downtown San Francisco, and Dad had remarked in the book about the interesting architecture, and they acquired free railroad maps, which were going to prove to be useful for them in their travels to come. Hershel's sister Winifred took the men out the next day. They had a really wonderful fine dining experience in one of those mansions that had been turned into a restaurant. And then she took them over to the Golden Gate Bridge and to see San Francisco Bay. But she needed to get back to her family. She gave them instructions about how they could get across the bay to Oakland and where to find the streetcars to take out to the highways that would get them to where they would need to start hitchhiking the next day. So she dropped them off at the railroad station, still up there in San Francisco. They had their bags repacked. They were shipping their suitcases to Vancouver. And my dad thought it might be a good idea to have a little cash when he got to Canada, so he put $25 in the suitcase and sent that on with his clothes in preparation for their anticipation at arriving in Canada. I don't think I have time to read some of the things I would like to have shared with you.
Did the money work to exchange it at that time? Or was that not a problem like it is now?
We'll get to that, sort of. Sort of. Good question, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. In the story, Dad's reminding the reader that trains, the locomotives that were pulling the trains in those days were steam engines. And what did they burn? Coal. What did they belch out of their smokestack? A lot of black smoke. And he talks about they did catch their first train out of Oakland and were sitting with their backs to the engine so as not to get all of that black smoke in their face when Dad felt something hit the back of his head, and he reached up and looked up and saw some pendants kind of hanging down from a wire across the railroad track, and he said to Jim, "We're coming to a tunnel, get down." And they had to get off of the catwalk and down. The sides of a boxcar sloped off a little bit, kept their back knapsacks on the side lowest from the roof of the tunnel that they were going in, and they closed their eyes when they went into the tunnel, but it was a long tunnel. They still breathed a lot of smoke, and when they came out the other side, they sat up and looked at each other, and they just burst out laughing. They were just covered with soot from that experience. When the train stopped at a rail yard to take on water, it turned out to be Sacramento Junction, which they were hoping to get to, and were hoping they hadn't overshot that because they slept a few hours. And they walked around until they found a stream adequate, with water running in the stream, adequate for cooking oatmeal and for washing up and for washing their dishes. I'm going to skip that one. I remembered an amazing amount of stuff about some of these. By the time they reached Northern California and Central Oregon, they had 2 incidents where they got pulled off of the trains. In the first incident, a railroad detective pulled them both off the train, took them into the office, they had to empty all of their stuff, and they got grilled about who they were and all of the details like that. They were scolded about trespassing on railroad property and to head out to the highways, and he let them go. The second time that they got pulled off, there were 2 railroad detectives on either side of the train, and they pulled Jim off on the left side and Hershel off on the right side, took them into separate offices, and they separated these fellas. Gave them the same grilling, the same admonishment to go back to the highways to hitchhike, and let them go. But Hershel couldn't find Jim. Kind of following a rule that they had made that if you get separated, go to the next town and wait. He did that. No Jim. Went to the next town and waited several hours. No Jim. And of course, Jim was carrying half of some of the equipment that they shared for their meals, etc. So this was a problem. Hershel was a little perplexed and not knowing for sure what to do, but he did have these plans to stop to see his uncle in McMinnville, Oregon, and decided to go ahead with those plans. Maybe Jim would be in at McMinnville. That's where they were planning to go. I think he was able to hitchhike off of the road to the town. He said it was just a little village. It was pretty clear that there was no Jim there either. But he did call up the uncle, found out that they were just on a small farm about 3 miles out of the town, and Dad said by then 3 miles was kind of an easy hike for him to make. He spent some time visiting that evening with a friend, with the uncle and his family. It was a Friday, and that family was planning a weekend at the beach and had made arrangements with some neighbors to come and milk their cows. And his uncle says, "Do you know how to milk cows?" And Dad says, "Certainly I know how to milk cows." And he said, "Well, how about if you stay here for a few days while we go to the beach, and you can rest, there's plenty of food." And that all sounded really good to Hershel at the time. So he agreed to it. And they were gone then by Saturday morning, and by Sunday afternoon, my dad was really realizing that without Jim McGibbon, he was in a bad situation. And the longer he waited that his chances of reconnecting with Jim were growing slimmer and slimmer. So he made sure that all arrangements were made for the milk cows, and left his note of thanks and took a sandwich with him and hitchhiked into McMinnville, and then was able to find a pretty quick hitchhiking to Portland, and was able to board a fast train for Seattle overnight. Hershel says Seattle was a big city. and I felt my chances of finding Jim there were almost nil. However, I did check a large jungle where the hobos stayed. They were called jungles or Hoovervilles. We found one close to the railroads in a popular food market area. Finding no sign of Jim there either, Hershel was out of money. He had 2 cents left. And it was urgent for him to get to Vancouver and to get his suitcase and the $25 that were in that suitcase. He says, I started hitchhiking the next morning, having had nothing to eat in the past day and a half. I was so hungry that I started checking along the road every motorist cast-off I saw. Finally, I found a small grocery bag that was not flattened. Giving it a little nudge with my foot, I could tell there was something in it. Looking into it, I saw a couple of donuts, a sweet roll, and about 50 diligent ants working on it. And he says, wow, he needed the food worse than they did, and dusted them all off and ate the donuts and the roll, and he said it was like manna from heaven. And with a good drink of water from his canteen, he was on his way again, much refreshed. Hitchhiking was not good that day. You know, from Seattle to the border was about 107 miles. Hitchhiking wasn't very good, but he did cover the 107 miles to the border by late in the afternoon and crossed into Canada to customs, 100 or so yards beyond the border. There was an officer that stopped me and wanted to know what my destination was. When I told him Vancouver, he motioned me to go inside, where another officer politely but firmly took notes on my answers to the many questions he asked. And I struck out on many. For example, where was I to meet Jim McGibbon? Probably at his sister's place. What was her name and address? Hershel didn't know her married name, and he didn't know their address. How do you expect to find her? And he says, well, she's a nurse at the hospital. And the interrogator says, which one? And my dad says, there's more than one? That was his small town experience. And he was told probably more than 50. And he looked at the 2 cents on the table and he says, is this all the money you have? And Hershel says, yes, but I have $25 in the suitcase we shipped from San Francisco. He says, which station? Which railroad? And Hershel had no idea. He says, boy, oh boy, I sorely needed Jim about now. The officer recited some of the laws and concluded that he could not let him pass because he was too apt to become a ward of the state. And to get back past the U.S. Customs station, he was issued an order of deportation. And if you care to look at a copy of it, there's one on the table up here that you might check out after we're finished. It was dated August 16th. What day did he leave?
17th.
July 17th. By now he's been on the road 30 days. And it was 9:30 p.m. When he wrote this, he said he'd forgotten how late it was in the day that deportation occurred. So it didn't matter that he couldn't cash the $25 that he had in his suitcase.
He couldn't go get it.
No.
He didn't know where it was at.
No. They sent him home. That's why you've got the red line on the map up here.
How could they not know where it was going when they shipped it off? Wouldn't they have known?
I suspect that Jim McGibbon took care of the details on that
Oh,
since
I
he
know.
was the Canadian and would have known where they were going and where they needed to pick it up and all of that kind of stuff. Yes.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yes.
It's always the other half that knows everything.
And what do you do if you've just been deported from Canada at 9:30 in the evening? The dad was walking and came to a wheat field that had been cut, and the wheat had been shocked and was standing with, like the 3 bundles together. And he saw an opportunity, and he climbed over the fence and found where he could get in underneath where there was some airspace and everything, and slept under shocks of wheat that night. He got a handful of wheat kernels that he ate for his supper and washed down with water from his canteen, and repeated that for his breakfast the next morning. That afternoon, or the next afternoon, well, I said he's up the next morning, he's still walking. So Hershel was making his way back to Seattle. Might have gotten a few rides, but he walked most of the way, and one of the concerns was he developed a couple of calluses on his heels. When he got to the jungle in Seattle that he had seen when he was looking for Jim going north, about 50 yards away, he found a little enclosure that was made with railroad ties in the back of a building. And he went to the hobo camp and struck up a conversation with a guy and said, "Has that place been claimed by anybody?" And he was told no. And so he claimed that as the place where he was going to stay. And he talked with that fellow for quite a while and got some good information. The man was reluctantly friendly. There were some things that they needed to be careful about, and things like don't let on that you have any money, and you just needed to be careful. But he said that they were close to that farmer's market and a fish market and a meat market. And if you went late in the afternoon before they closed at 6, you might get fresh produce that's not fresh enough to put out the next day. You might get, they knew that a large fish head had a couple of good-sized mussels behind the gills that could be cooked up for a meal. And they could sometimes get a good soup bone from the meat market. That was valuable information. The markets weren't necessarily reliable sources of food, but they were a big help. Now, Sir Hershel had several big things that he had to deal with. Number one was he needed some money. With his 2 cents, the first thing he did that next day was to go to the post office and buy 2 penny postcards. And he sent one to his parents to let him know where he was and what was going on. And he sent one to his brother Wilford, asking him for a loan of maybe a few dollars, and to send it to him, general delivery, Seattle, Washington. And there are other ways that he went out and tried to earn a little bit of money. He might go out looking for a business that might allow him to wash some windows. And he found one place that paid him 25 cents for doing some of that. But the other thing was, those calluses that he developed on his foot were starting to hurt, and one of them was starting to bleed. It was bothering him. And that was a Saturday. The next day was Sunday, and everything was closed. So what he decided to do with his time that day was to walk out to the University of Washington, where his brother was enrolled. Even though Wilford wasn't there, he wanted to see the university, and he knew that Wilford would be disappointed if he didn't. And he was just really mightily impressed with the University of Washington. He thought that was the most beautiful campus he had ever been on. But by then he'd walked quite a bit, and he kind of was paying attention to how far it was to walk back, and he estimates that the university was about 5 miles each way. So he walked 10 miles to make that little excursion out to the university. And by the time he got back, he was limping, one of his heels was bleeding. He had a problem there that was growing and needing some some attention. But that's not all he discovered when he got back to the hobo camp. That morning, not wanting to go out to the University of Washington looking any more like a hobo than he already did, he decided to leave his knapsack in that little enclosure that he had sort of claimed for his place to be. And when he got back, it was gone.
This is where we say, "Aw."
You know, after the trauma of getting turned back at the border, and now, you know, his knapsack is gone. His mess kit was gone. His canteen was gone. He went over and talked to the gentleman that he had talked to when he first arrived at the hobo camp and asked him if he knew anything about it. And no, he hadn't taken it. He said, but there was somebody that was here, and he cooked a meal. He indicated a place where that meal had been cooked, and when he left, he was carrying a knapsack. Oh, and yes, Dad's Northwestern sweater was in there too. Gone. Hershel was mad. And then he was mad at himself and for being so naive, and really decided that, well, there wasn't a whole lot to do, except that now he really was in a bad way because he had lost a lot of his equipment. The gentleman that he talked to indicated where the other guy had cooked a meal, and Hershel went over there and looked around, and he found his spare underwear in the bushes, and back in the bushes a few other of the utensils that he had used for cooking. But he needed some money. I mentioned that he had gone out to wash some windows, I think. He was offering to do that for 10 cents. But he got hired to wash some large windows, and they paid him 25 cents. And that afternoon, he decided to walk to a nearby hospital and see if he could get any kind of help for this wound that he had on his heel. And they asked if he had any money to pay for a treatment, and of course he did not. And she says, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you. But he doesn't remember who told him, but they said if you could soak your heel in a basin of hot water about as hard as you could stand it, with salt, plenty of salt, that would help. And so walking back to the hobo camp, my father looked for something that he could use for a basin to soak his heel in, and found a 5-gallon oil can that he beat into kind of a basin shape so that he could heat some water in that. And that evening he created his little basin for soaking his heel and cooked his supper and sat there and ate his little meal from the market that he was able to bring home that night. He was there for about 3 or 4 days with things kind of just routine. He was checking the post. Oh, there's one story that we heard, and we heard it often. Well, anyway, he decided to walk into a neighborhood area in the vicinity and see if he could maybe get a job mowing a lawn or something like that. And while he was walking down the street, he saw a woman bent over, pulling weeds in her flower bed in front of her house. And so he walked up into the yard and approached her and said, excuse me. And when she stood up, this was a black woman. Now that didn't bother Dad, but just kind of, it's kind of important to the story. And he asked her, he said, could I do some work for you in your yard in exchange for maybe a bread and butter sandwich? And she looked at him and she said, have you eaten today? And he said, no. And she said, well, come on in. she says, I'll fix you something. So they went around to the back door, and he started to sit down on the shelf, and she said, no, you come on in. And she fixed the best meal that he had had since fine dining in San Francisco. And he was just deeply, deeply appreciative. And I'll tell you that when we were kids growing up, Dad would share these stories, and he would say, doesn't matter the color of your skin, you're no better than anybody else. We were taught to respect individuals, who they were, and how they treated you. And that was an important lesson for us to learn. And I don't think it began for Dad at that experience. You know, our great-grandfather fought in the Civil War for the North. They were doing it for the slaves to be freed and so forth. So that's a lesson that came down for our family pretty strongly. The next day, Hershel checked at the post office in Seattle and kept on doing that until Friday, August 25th, he got a letter from his brother Wilford with $5 in it. He bought a 3-cent stamped envelope so that he could write his mother. He sent a petty postcard to his brother to thank him for sending the money. And he bought another, but with that $5, he went out and he was able to replace the knapsack, the mess kit, the canteen, soap and towel, and maybe a few more items. But he determined that he was not going to spend any more than $4. He probably got a little bit of food to go with that. And with that accomplished, he's ready to go home. So the rest of the story is, what was it like getting home from Seattle? Hershel got some advice from some of the hobos in the camp that taking the scenic route east and across the northern states might be a cold journey. When they were going across the Cascades in eastern Washington, in the Rocky Mountains, over in Montana, etc. So he decided that he was going to retrace his steps to Sacramento and head east across the country from Sacramento. One of those days he was riding a gondola, which was one of those kind of flatbed cars that just had a small side to it. And that car was transporting a couple of bundles of lumber. And he was able to sit down in the car and brace his feet against the front end of the car. And he slept really well through the night. By then, you know, the rocking of the train was something that he was used to. And when he woke up, his knees were almost up to his chin. And he climbed up out of the gondola and onto the car, the box car in front of it. And some of the men that were riding up on top of that box car said, "Did you ride down in that gondola overnight?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "Don't you know that's dangerous?" He even had a 2x4 that was sticking out between his arm, under his arm. And he didn't have to be warned twice. That was not a good way for them to travel. He did make a stop in Roseburg on the way south. And when they got off, one of the things that he did was go looking for a job that he might be able to get buy a little bit of food, and stopped at a meat market. And the guy said, "Well, we just got done grinding some sausage. Do you know how to clean a meat grinder?" And Hershel said, "Well, I was taught how to clean the cream separator on the farm back home. And if it's not any more complicated than that," he says, I think I can handle it," which he did. And the gentleman said, "Well, I don't have a good soup bone for you," but he gave him about 2 pounds of cold cuts. And Hershel was just ecstatic with that, and he went out and found a loaf of bread for 10 cents. And he was set for a little while for food. Soon he was at Sacramento and heading east from Sacramento towards Salt Lake City. And there were several things that Hershel had in mind that he wanted to do and see while he was in Salt Lake City. He says that he saw the Great Salt Lake and the salt flats. He was just so amazed by all of the terrain and the things that there were to see out there. Now there's one story. Dad never told us when we were kids. And I'd like to invite Dennis Troyer. Dennis is here with us today. He and my dad became very good friends after my parents moved from Pennsylvania out here to Indiana. And I'd like Dennis to read that story for you.
Okay.
I've been okay if Gail would have read this, but I'll do it in honor of Hershel. He's a very good friend, like you said, and I miss him very much. I had a birthday yesterday, the 8th, his was the 9th, and my son Luke's birthday's the 10th, so we had a good connection there.
Lots of birthdays.
I'll try to read this in a way that you can understand. And there are 3 experiences that are still vivid in my memory about Salt Lake City. After I had eaten a bit and packed again, I was so tired and dirty that I decided to get a room in a cheap hotel if I could. I walked around until I found a second-floor hotel that advertised low rates. I went up the well-worn stairs to the office and found I could get a room for 75 cents. The bathroom and the shower were available in separate communal rooms. I did not like to spend my last 75 cents, but I really wanted to get to bed. So I paid him. He gave me a key to a room 2 more stories up and pointed to the stairway. Once inside my room, I decided to get to bed right away and wait until morning to take my shower. I had been in bed only a very few minutes, and there came a knock at the door. I sat up and said, "Who is it?" "Would you like to have a woman sleep with you tonight?" was the reply. "No," I said, and lay back down. I was just about asleep when I felt something crawling on my leg. I brushed it off with my hand under the covers and tried to go to sleep again. Soon, though, there were 2 more, with my left hand a hold of the upper edge of the bedclothes, and reaching to the light switch with my right hand, I simultaneously turned on the light and threw back the covers. Lo and behold, 4 bed bugs. I hopped out of bed, dressed, took my gear, and went down to the front desk. "Yes, you need something?" "Yes." "There are bed bugs in the bed up there, and I can't sleep in a bed with bed bugs," I told him. "Oh, we can fix that," he said, and turned around, pulled a can of spray off the shelf, just like we used to spray the cows at milking time to keep the flies off. "Do you expect me to sleep in a bed sprayed for bed bugs?" I asked incredulously. "No," I said, "I would rather go down and sleep in a clean boxcar. I'd like to have my 75 cents back." With my 75 cents back, I went back to the railroad yards, found an empty car, and climbed in. I had a good rest.
Hershel was dirty. He wanted a bath. And one of the things that he wanted to do in Salt Lake City was to go to the Mormon Tabernacle and hear the organ recital at noontime. So he went down to the Jordan River. I didn't know the river past Salt Lake City was called the Jordan River. But I love the biblical connotation here. And he found a place under a bridge that was about half a mile from the center of the city where he could strip down and walk out into the water with his bar of soap and get washed off as best as he could. But he didn't have any clean clothes to put on. But nonetheless, he felt that he'd gotten at least that much wash-up done. He did go to the organ recital, and because his clothes weren't clean, he sat in the back. He enjoyed the music, and they also did what they called the pin drop. The acoustics were so famous at the Mormon Tabernacle that if they dropped a pin on the stage, anywhere that you were in the auditorium, you could hear the pin drop. You could hear it land on the floor. And Dad, being at the back of the auditorium, could attest to the fact that indeed he could hear that pin drop. He loved that experience. He checked at the post office, no mail. From Salt Lake City, they're going east towards Denver, and Hershel remarks about how beautiful the Rocky Mountains were. They stopped near Colorado, and he learned that they were going to cross the Rockies that night and the Continental Divide, which meant they were going to be at some significant altitude and that it was likely to be cold. So he wadded up newspaper and stuffed it into his sleeves and into his pant legs and into his coat and everything. When he woke up the next morning, he had frost on him, but he was warm. They did the job. He was wakened that morning by another one of the hobos riding on top of the train, and he said, "You might want to get up for this. We're coming through the Royal Gorge in Colorado." And that gorge is about 1,000 feet deep. There's an interesting picture up here that you might want to look at. And Hershel was just impressed. That gorge was amazing. And he said that little bridge up on top just looks so flimsy. Many years later, I was with Dad out in Colorado, Dad and Mom and relatives, and we went to one of the chuck wagon dinners, and they had some entertainment afterwards, and they were singing a song about some, maybe Sister Sue or something like that. And in one of the stanzas, they remarked that she's sitting on the Royal Gorge Bridge, dangling her feet in the water. And that would just amuse my father so much. He just burst out laughing at that experience, and I'm sure he was remembering his ride through the Royal Gorge back in 1933. They came into Pueblo, Colorado. There were no tunnels like there are today for the trains to cross the Rockies closer to Denver. And it was a while before it was a couple of days before he was going to be able to get a ride up to Denver. But when he did get to Denver, he hit pay dirt. There were 3 letters for him at the post office. One was from his brother DeForest, who remarked that he surely hoped that he'd have a chance to visit some of the national parks out west before he came home. And he said clearly DeForest had no idea what his situation was. And one of the letters was from his mother, and she was really happy to hear that she'd received his letter, and was really happy to hear that he was on his way home. And anticipating his situation a little bit, she said, "I'm sending a package of clean clothes to the Smiths in Evanston when you get back." And the other letter was from his brother Russell, who put a $5 bill in that and hoped that 5 spot might do him some good. And Dad says, what he really wanted was for me to get home and help paint the house. And Hershel bought a couple of more postcards and envelopes. He sent a letter home thanking them, sent a letter to the Smiths. Went back to the railroad station so that he could be getting the next trains out. By this time he'd had food to eat and washed up in the railroad restroom, that kind of stuff. He talked to 2 men that were at that jungle at the rail yard. And one of them was a fellow that had been out in Colorado panning for gold that summer. But he was going home. It was getting fall time. He wasn't prepared to be there for that part of the year. And this was a man that had an interesting knife that he was using. My father was asking him about it, and he said, well, he made that from a steel file. He had filed this down, created a handle, and at the time that he saw that, it had bark still on the handle. I was an adult before this knife that had been in my mother's drawer all the years I was growing up was part of my life, and I didn't know that that's how Dad came by that knife. He inquired whether it might be for sale, and the man, probably needing some cash if he had a chance to, was, well, and Dad said, how much? He said 75 cents. And he bought the knife, and at this point he's seen it as maybe being a nice souvenir to take home. The other fellow that he met was a barber from Ohio that was about 10 years older from him than he was. And he had been to the West Coast and had been looking for work up and down the West Coast and found it no better than it was anywhere else, and he was going back home. But he had some experiences that turned out to be pretty valuable. That train arrived in Kankakee, Illinois, because they weren't going to be able to get a direct one into Chicago. And from Kankakee, they took they hopped onto a commuter train to the 63rd Street station, and from there, they were really close, just a block or two away from streetcar line that would take them into downtown Chicago. Except they needed 10 cents apiece for the fare for the streetcar. Dad didn't admit he still had that 75 cents in his pocket. And the guy said, I can get the money. And he had some panhandling skills. And I'll just leave it at that. But it was kind of fun to read how Dad, how they got their 20 cents, got onto the streetcar, got their transfers to be able to take the streetcars all over the city, anywhere they wanted to go that day. He dropped his buddy off near the World's Fair and said, if you'll wait here for me tomorrow, I will come back and I will give you my pass to the World's Fair. And you can visit the World's Fair, and you might even be able to go in and apply for a job. And he felt like the buddy was probably going to trust him enough to be there the next morning. Since my dad did have the 75 cents, he spent a quarter of it to take the elevated to Evanston. When he got to the Smith's house, they were out that evening, but the maid let them in. She thought that it would be okay if he cleaned up and slept the night in his old room. He retrieved the $25 from the book that he had left in the box there and said that he would be back in a few days, borrow somebody's car, a brother's car, and be back to pick up the rest of his belongings. The next day, he traveled back down to where he had dropped off his buddy, and sure enough, he was there. He gave him his pass to the World's Fair and watched to make sure that he got in okay. Gave him a few dollars and wished him well. And from here on, Hershel was eager to get home. He rode 4 streetcars to the end of each line and then transferred until he got home to Valparaiso. The last couple paragraphs in this book says, it took me about 4 hours to get home. I had not contacted my home since I left Denver, so when I arrived home and walked in, my mother was almost overcome with tears and gave me a great big hug and let me know how glad she was that I had arrived home safely. As my dad and brother Russell each came home, they too were happy that I had finally gotten home. They had so many questions, and I had so much to tell that we were a little late getting to bed that night.
Thank you, Gail.